Sexual selection occurs when one member of a species, typically the female, selects for certain traits in the males with which she mates. What she's selecting for are traits possessed by one sex of the species but not the other. These are called sexual dimorphisms. These could be behaviors such as the intricate dance performed by the male bird of paradise to attract female mates, or the smashing of heads together by rams in order to gain the right to mate with the females of the herd. Or they could be traits such as the eye spots on the tail of a peacock, or the elongated tail of the male bowerbird. These sexual dimorphisms at first glance appear to be anti-Darwinian in nature, since they do appear to make the organisms less able to survive. But on the other hand, as we'll see, sexual selection might be the most Darwinian form of natural selection that we've seen yet. So stay tuned. Sexual selection has been an interesting topic of evolutionary study since the very beginning. It was a source of consternation for Charles Darwin and some of his early pro-evolutionary thinkers, because at first glance, when you see a peacock with its brightly colored tails, or the brightly colored epaulets on the shoulder of a red-winged blackbird, or the amount of energy spent by a bowerbird to build its bower to attract a mate, all of these things seem anti-evolutionary. They seem anti-Darwinian, because none of these things seem to benefit the survival of those individuals. They either stick out more to their predators or they waste their energy doing things that don't seem to be very productive. These traits, these behaviors that we observe in certain members of a species but not others, are known as sexual dimorphisms. And these sexual dimorphisms were pointed to by early opponents of evolution to almost say, see, natural selection doesn't always work. But after decades and decades of research, what we will actually find is that sexual selection might be the most Darwinian of all forms of natural selection and evolution. But before we can understand how sexual selection works and why sexual selection might occur at all, the first question we actually need to ask ourselves is why sex? Why sex in the first place? It's interesting to note that almost every single multicellular species on the planet reproduces through sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction actually doesn't make a ton of sense if you think about it strictly from an energetic standpoint. Why would it evolve in the first place, and why would it continue to persist? John Maynard Smith famously coined the term the twofold cost of sex. When you compare a sexually reproducing species to an asexually reproducing species, it appears that asexual reproduction has several profound advantages over sexual reproduction. The twofold cost of sex, according to John Maynard Smith, is as follows. First off, when you reproduce sexually, you will only pass half of your genetic information on to the next generation. Only half of you makes it into your offspring. If you reproduce asexually, all of you makes it into your offspring. And if you're ideally suited for your environment, well, then your offspring, or clones of you, will be equally suited. If you reproduce sexually, well, you only pass half of your information on to the next generation. The other issue has also been termed the cost of males. Only half of the population of any sexually reproducing species can actually produce offspring, the females. Males don't produce future generations, they just contribute sperm to the process for the most part. It's the females that actually are able to produce offspring. And if you think about it this way, for humans, for example, it's a 2-to-1. Most commonly, it takes 2 humans to produce a single human baby. Add to that the energetic cost of trying to find a mate and the relative lack of success that many individuals have in finding a mate, of all species, I should state. And you begin to wonder why sex would ever evolve in the first place, and why, of all cases, it would persist. John Maynard Smith actually calculated that within just a few dozen generations, a random variant that allowed a female to reproduce asexually in any sexually reproducing population would spread so fast in just a few dozen generations that it would overtake the entire population, and that species would then begin reproducing asexually from that point forward. But this really hasn't happened. There's only a few species we've ever examined where this has happened. Why not? What is the benefit to sexual reproduction? And the answer likely comes from the fact that sexual reproduction allows very rapid mixing of genetic information, whereas asexual reproduction does not. Let's look at the following hypothetical example. Let's look at two populations, one of an asexually reproducing species and another of a sexually reproducing species. Now, we're going to say that the original populations each contain two phenotypes for two different traits, little a and little b. Little a and little b are nice, and they allow individuals to survive. But suddenly, mutations occur within these populations, leading to a big A phenotype and a big B phenotype. Now, if you're little a, big B phenotype, or big A, little b phenotype, you have some advantage. You're benefited over those that have both the little a and the little b phenotype, okay? But if you can have both the big A and the big B phenotype, now you're highly adapted and significantly more advantaged over anybody with either just big A, or just big B, or definitely over the individuals that have both the little a and the little b phenotype. Now again, we're talking about phenotype, not genotype, the outward appearance of the trait. So let's look at what would happen first in an asexual population. In an asexually reproducing population, a random mutation occurs in an individual cell. It causes this random variant to now have the big A phenotype. In a completely separate individual, a mutation occurs leading to the evolution of the big B phenotype. Now, the individual that is big A, little b in terms of phenotype, and little a, big B in terms of phenotype, have a reproductive advantage over other members of the population, and they will begin reproducing in slightly higher numbers because they're better adapted. But because they reproduce sexually, they will only go on to essentially make clones of themselves. So you'll have some members of the population that are big A, little b in terms of phenotype, and little a and big B in terms of phenotype, and the population or the species as a whole will be somewhat better adapted. But the only way in which the big A, big B adaptation could actually occur is if a second random mutation occurs in one of those individuals that has the big A and little b phenotype, or a mutation causing big A in an organism that has the little a, big B phenotype. Do you see the problem here? When you reproduce asexually, gene mixing doesn't actually occur. In fact, there's a big discussion as to whether a gene pool is actually a thing in asexual species. A gene pool refers to the sum total of the genetic information within a population, the allele presences. That's what we're talking about here, different versions of a gene, alleles. Well, is there really a gene pool in an asexual species? Kind of no, because it's not ever possible for that big A, the genes encoding that big A phenotype, to make it into an organism that has the big B phenotype. You would need a second completely random mutation to occur. You need lightning to strike twice in order to get big A, big B in any one individual. And that could take a very long time or never happen at all. Moreover, what if conditions, let's say it does happen, let's say lightning does strike twice, and we do end up with an individual that has both the big A and the big B phenotype. That particular individual will probably rapidly take over the population because they're going to clone themselves over and over and over again, making big A, big B asexually reproducing cells. And because they're so highly advantaged over big A, little b and big B, little a, that they'll begin to dominate the population. And you might think this is great. Now we have this super adapted asexually reproducing species that's highly adapted for their environment. Awesome. But let's remember something. Let's go back to our conversation about relative fitness. Conditions change. And if conditions change and all of a sudden big A, big B phenotype is no longer beneficial, there's really no good way to get back to big A, little b, or little a, big B, or little a, little b, is there? No. because there would have to now be 2 new mutations to essentially revert back to the old phenotype. If that doesn't happen, or there aren't some individuals around in the population that still have little a, big B, or little b, big A, those alleles are gone forever. And if this species can't adapt, it might just go extinct. So while asexual reproduction can occur very quickly and can result in the production of ideally suited individuals, that idealness really is dependent on the environmental conditions staying the same. And this might be the advantage that we see in sexually reproducing species. So let's look at the same scenario, but let's do it in a sexually reproducing species. A spontaneous mutation occurs, causing one sexually reproducing individual to have the big A, little b phenotype. And a second mutation occurs in a completely separate individual that has the little a, now that will have the little a, big B phenotype. Well, over time, since these 2 individuals both have a subtle reproductive advantage, they're more reproductively fit, right? More fitness, they'll produce slightly more offspring, which means the prevalence of the big A phenotype and the big B phenotype will increase within the gene pool of this species. So it's only a matter of time, a few short generations, before at least one individual with the big A, little b, and the little a, big B phenotype reproduce sexually to produce offspring. And we can do some simple Punnett square analyses, but if we assume complete dominance, for example, of big A phenotype over little a and big B phenotype over little b, the odds are the subsequent generations are going to end up about 1/4 big A, big B phenotype, 1/4 or 1/2 heterozygote, big A, little b, or little a, big B, and 1/4 little a, little b, right? Just do a Punnett square. Now, those that are little a, little b probably won't survive very long, won't likely produce in very high numbers, because the big A, big B phenotype is awesome right now and it's going to take over the population. Except remember that we're dealing with sexual reproduction, and there are going to be 2 copies of each gene. And some of those individuals are going to be heterozygotes, which means in these generations of offspring, as these matings occur, you're not going to end up with a population that's strictly homozygous big A, homozygous big B in terms of genotype. So you're going to continue to produce individuals that are big A, big B, big A, little b phenotype, little a, big B phenotype, and the occasional little a, little b phenotype. Simply because sexual reproduction is all about probability, right? Inheritance is just probability. See my video on Mendelian genetics. That means these recessive alleles, these currently not favored alleles, still exist in the population. As a result, should conditions change and big A, big B phenotype no longer be advantageous, the species isn't doomed. Because natural selection will act on the species. And eventually, those sort of rare weirdos that are little a and little b, they'll become, in this case, perhaps advantageous. And they'll begin populating in higher numbers, passing on their little a, little b phenotypes to subsequent generations. And over time, the population will change to now look more like little a, little b. But those big A and big B alleles will never actually go together. And if conditions change again, the big A and or the big B phenotype can come back and save the species yet again. This is the advantage to sexual reproduction. This is what overcomes all of the costs of finding a mate and only contributing half your genetic information to the next generation and only half of the individuals in the population being able to produce offspring. It's genetic flexibility. It's quite likely that sexual reproduction has persisted as long as it has because it makes species more evolutionarily flexible. You get the advantage of having, for example, dominant alleles that can mask the phenotype of recessive alleles and hide them. They don't have to leave completely. So whether you're a heterozygote or a homozygote for that particular trait, it doesn't matter. You still have the good phenotype. And those less favorable alleles can hide out in the population. And if conditions change, as they always do, those alleles are not lost and gone forever. So if we know that there are benefits to sexual reproduction, why were Darwin and his contemporaries so concerned about the effect that these sexual dimorphisms had on a species and the impact that sexual selection had on Darwinian evolution as a whole? Well, it's simple. They didn't have all the information that we have today, and instead they were looking at it from a superficial perspective. Let's look at some of these sexual dimorphisms. Let's look at the highly ornamented tail of the peacock. Let's look at the extremely long tail of the long-tailed widowbird. Let's look at the elaborate bowers built by male bowerbirds. Let's look at the headbutting that bull buffaloes and rams have to go through in order to win mates. None of these traits seem to benefit the individual. None of them seem to boost the survival. And remember, Darwinian evolution was very quickly termed, not by Darwin, might I add, survival of the fittest. But we have to go back to what being the fittest means. What is important about reproductive fitness? What are the two key characteristics? Survival is one of them. And if you don't survive long enough, then whatever traits you have don't matter, because they won't be passed on to the subsequent generation. But it's the second part of reproductive fitness that sexual selection is based on. It's not based on survival. It's based on reproduction. Remember, reproductive fitness requires you to both survive and reproduce. And while many of these traits more than likely reduce the survivability of the individuals who possess them, in the long term, they boost the reproductive success of those individuals. And as a result, are fixed in the population because they do improve reproductive fitness. They do it by boosting the reproductive side of the scale at the cost of the survivability side of the scale. So how might these sexual dimorphisms have arisen in the first place? How could certain sexually selected traits arise in a species that doesn't have them to begin with? Well, here's a very plausible and likely scenario by which it occurs. Let's use the long-tailed widowbird as an example. The long-tailed widowbird, the males of this species have an exceedingly long tail that the females don't have. Now, Malte Anderson and his colleagues were able to show very succinctly that the length of a male long-tailed widowbird's tail correlates very strongly with its reproductive success. In fact, they were actually able to manipulate it by lengthening the tail to attract more mates, or by shortening the tail to deter mating. It's actually a pretty strong correlation between the length of the tail and the number of mates that occur. So how might this have evolved in the first place? So let's say, through random mutations, one male of the species ends up with a slightly longer tail than the rest of the males. And for whatever reason, more of the females in that population choose to mate with this particular male long-tailed widowbird. Well, as a result, the offspring from this mating, particularly the males, will have slightly longer tails than the products of other matings. At the same time, the females of these matings would likely inherit their mom's preference for those long-tailed individuals. And over time, the longer the tail of the individual, the more mates in that population that particular individual is likely to get. And what you see is, just through the process of sexual selection, there's an amplification, a preference for those males that have a long tail, and then that leads to subsequent generations of longer-tailed males and subsequent generations of choosier females that prefer the longer tail. And over time, you just end up with this particular dimorphism locked into the population. This is a very plausible scenario, and you can easily see how these dimorphisms would have evolved, whether it's the feather coloration of cardinals or the size of the antlers on a bull elk. All of these things could very easily have arisen simply through the selection, the choosiness of the females of the species, and the amplification as a result of those particular dimorphisms. So do we actually have proof that sexual dimorphisms actually correlate with enhanced reproductive success? And the answer is a resounding yes. As I mentioned before, Malte Anderson and his colleagues did a very lengthy study in long-tailed widowbirds. And what they were able to do is manipulate the length of the widowbird's tail. If they shortened the tail of a long-tailed male, it would receive fewer matings than it would if you left it unaltered. If you lengthened the tail artificially of an already long-tailed male widowbird, they would get more matings than if you just left them alone. So what this says in this study is that the females are specifically selecting mates on the basis of that trait. We see the same thing with peacocks. So peahens choose their mates at something called a lek. All the peacocks get together, show off the eye spots on their tail feathers, and then the peahens select which males they're going to mate with. Several studies have shown that simply by masking the eye spots, you can decrease a male's reproductive success. And by adding artificial eye spots or artificial tail feathers to increase the number of eye spots that the peacock is displaying, you can increase the number of matings that particular male gets. Again, showing that the peahens are selecting specifically for that particular dimorphism. If we get away from birds and look at amphibians for a little bit, let's look at gray tree frogs. Gray tree frog males attract mates by calling. They make a calling sound. Now, what we've noticed, or what I should say, what was noticed, is that certain males in the population have a longer call, and certain males have a shorter call. Now, in order to do this study, the researchers took recordings of long-called males and short-called males, and then observed which ones the females responded to in higher numbers. And lo and behold, it turns out that females responded almost 2 to 1, actually over 2 to 1, to the longer call male calls than they did to the shorter ones. In other words, female tree frogs respond to the length of the male's call. The longer the call, the more successful that male would be. Now, again, I must stress that that isn't exactly a survival advantage. Being loud and calling a long time gives away your position and could make you a target for a potential predator if you are a male gray tree frog. But because it gives you increased mating success, it is favored in sexual selection. So we have tons of evidence that sexual selection does exist, and that the choosier member of the species, almost always the female, is choosing for distinct aspects of that particular male's phenotype, whether it's a long call, the ability to win fights, or simply the number of eye spots on a peacock's tail. So that brings us to 3 very important questions that we should answer in the context of sexual selection. First off, why is it almost always the males of the species that are ornamented when we look at sexually dimorphic species? Secondly, why is it almost always the females that get to be the choosier member of the species? And third, what are they choosing for at all? Why is there a reason to choose one particular phenotype over another? Why choose in the first place? So let's start by answering the first 2 questions, since they seem to kind of answer themselves. First, let's start by why females might always get to be the choosier member of the species. To answer that, let's look at the relative investment that the males and the females of a species that is sexually dimorphic are likely to have in the reproductive process. First off, males always have the smaller gamete. They have the sperm, whereas the females have the larger gamete, the egg. Females also typically have the burden of caring for that egg. So after fertilization, it's the mother that needs to either carry the egg or maintain the baby until it's born, or care for the eggs after they've hatched. Because almost all of these species have some sort of maternal investment, whether it's a bird that needs to feed its chicks, or a mammal that needs to give birth to live young, whatever it happens to be. The female member of the species almost always has a significantly higher investment in terms of time and energy in the reproductive process. Therefore, the most beneficial strategy for a female in this context is to be choosy with whom she mates. Because if she's not choosy and mates with just anybody, she's still burdened by making sure that she takes care of all of those young. In order to ensure that she has the best potential offspring and that her offspring have the best possible chance of surviving, it behooves her to be choosier about with whom she mates. Conversely, males, on the other hand, don't have as much burden. In many species, the sole job of a male in the reproductive process is fertilization. In many species, they don't form life partnerships with that particular female. They don't even spend time caring for their young. Essentially, they copulate and then move on. If you're a male, then, your reproductive strategy is best to ensure that your genes make it to the future generation to mate with as many females as possible. It's to be promiscuous. Now, to look for proof of this, what we have to recognize is that not all species are like this. Birds are a terrific example of looking at sexual selection and sexual dimorphisms because they're so heavily ornamented in some cases and not ornamented at all. And it turns out that there are 3 types of reproductive relationships that we observe across different bird species. The first one is a polygamous relationship. Great example of this is going to be the red-winged blackbird. So if you look at a red-winged blackbirds are highly ornamented. You can see that they have a jet black body with red and yellow epaulets on their wings, hence the term red-winged blackbird. This red epaulet is utilized to both attract mates, but also to scare off other males. See, the way that red-winged blackbirds attract females is by having a large territory. They actively patrol this territory, and any food sources and any females that exist within their territory they are able to mate with, and only they are able to mate with. So red-winged blackbirds constantly make all kinds of noise and attack any other birds or any males that might invade their territory, because the larger territory they have, the more resources they have at their disposal, as well as the more females they're able to recruit. If you look at the female member of the species, and this is what we commonly see in polygamous bird species, the females are drab. They're not trying to attract mates with their bright coloration, so their reproductive success isn't counterbalanced by being, or I should say this, the drab coloration offers them better camouflage. Remember, reproductive fitness for them isn't about the reproductive end, it's about the survival end of the scale. So over time, the more brightly colored the epaulets are, the more territory that male controls, the more females that particular male red-winged blackbird is able to mate with. Red-winged blackbirds don't really have any sort of investment in the paternal care of their young. So again, a highly promiscuous bird species where the males will mate with as many females as they possibly can. But let's turn the other way. Let's look at some species of birds that are not dimorphic with respect to their coloration. How about the emperor penguin? The emperor penguin is a classic example of a monogamous bird species. And we can tell they're monogamous just by looking at them. Note that the male and the female emperor penguin look identical to each other. There is no ornamentation. There is no ostentatious feather display, tail display, or coloration to a male emperor. And the reason why is male and female emperor penguins mate for life. And they raise their chicks together. When you look at a monogamous relationship, like emperor penguins have, the paternal and maternal investment with the offspring are identical. Famously, males spend the entire winter in Antarctica holding their single solitary egg on their feet, while the female penguins actually go out and hunt for food, and then they trade places in the spring once the eggs have hatched. In this case, there's no benefit for the male to be highly ornamented. They mate with a single individual and produce usually somewhere around 1, maybe 2 chicks any breeding season. They don't shift their balance of reproductive fitness to the reproductive end of things. In fact, they're on the other side of the survivability, just surviving until they can find a mate and reproduce. And time again, we can see this. Quite often, you can predict whether or not a bird species is polygamous or monogamous simply by looking at the differences or similarities between the males and the females of the species. And that brings us to the cardinal. See, the northern cardinal is a monogamous species under most considerations. Yet the males are brightly colored and ornamented a bright red, whereas the females are drab. So what gives? Well, it turns out that northern cardinal males are socially monogamous. They do find a primary partner with whom they breed, produce chicks, and assist in the raising of those chicks. But it is very common for a northern cardinal male to sneak off and have side copulations. They'll go off and try to reproduce with other females in the area. They'll always return home and form a bonded partnership with a single primary mate, but they'll wander off and often have side copulations with other females. As a result, they kind of have a balancing act going on. While they are monogamous under most considerations, they still retain their bright colorations in order to attract some of those side copulations. Let's get to the weirdness of seahorses. Seahorses are also sexually dimorphic, but in the case of seahorses, it's the female who is highly ornamented and brightly colored, and it's the male who's drab. At first glance, this would seem to put a dagger in the heart of our argument for how sexual selection works. Instead, it only provides the final proof that we need about our theory about sexual selection. Male seahorses are unique. Unlike most species, once the female fish lays eggs, the males then care for their eggs until they hatch. In other words, in seahorses, it's the male who has the higher investment in the reproductive process. And as a result, it's the male who is drab, and the female who benefits from having more copulations, for having more matings, from attracting more mates. And thus, she, in this particular species, is more highly ornamented, while it is the male who is drab. It's the male who's caring for the eggs, and it's the male who exists in the monogamous portion of the relationship. Seahorses are essentially the exception that proves the rule. They are the ones that actually show that, in fact, it really is tied to which has the higher investment in the reproductive process. So this brings us to the third question. What are they choosing for? What's the benefit to being choosy, whether it's the females of most species or the male seahorse? Well, the answer is multifold. Sometimes there could be direct benefits. What they could be choosing for, these choosy partners, are direct benefits. The thought that a male with these particular characteristics would be a better provider for the offspring, or be a better protector or partner for the choosy partner. In other words, being a better parent or a better partner would be a direct benefit. Is there evidence to support that there are direct benefits to individuals who display these characteristics? And the answer is yes. If we go back to our example of male cardinals actually get their coloration by ingesting berries, and the carotenoids that are in these berries make the male cardinal turn red. The same is true of house finches. It turns out that the more successful a male house finch is at acquiring food, berries and such, the brighter their color. And it turns out that females are choosy for males with a brighter color. But is there a benefit to those females choosing those males? Is there a direct benefit? In other words, is that particular male that is brighter in color a beneficial partner for that female or for her offspring? To study this, Jeff Hill and his colleagues actually examined house finch populations. They scored males on a scale for plumage brightness, and then they measured how many visits those male birds would make to their nest in an hour. In other words, per hour. In other words, to bring food to the nest. Were they better providers? And the answer turns out to be a resounding yes. There was a strong correlation between the brightness of the male and how many visits that male made to the nest. In other words, females were choosing correctly for primary benefits. It turns out that brighter colored males were, in fact, better providers for that particular female's offspring. There's also evidence for what we call indirect benefits. An indirect benefit could be the prediction from females that by choosing certain mates, that they will produce better quality offspring. In other words, the traits that she sees in that particular male are traits that she would like for her offspring because she thinks it will increase their survivability or make hardier offspring. Is there any proof that this is actually the case? And the answer is actually yes. We'll go to Allison Welch and her colleagues who studied those gray tree frogs from earlier. Remember those tree frogs with the long call and the short call? And the females greatly preferred males that were long callers as opposed to males that were short callers. Are they getting some kind of benefit from making this choice? And it turns out the answer is yes. I'll spare you all the experimental details. But the bottom line is the results of Allison Welch's and her colleagues' work showed very clearly that the resulting offspring of long call males not only developed faster, but also had enhanced survivability compared to those that were produced by short calling males. In other words, if female frogs are choosing long calling males because they believe they're getting some sort of improvement in their offspring, they're right. There are indirect benefits to choosing long calling males over short calling males. The offspring are hardier. They are more likely to survive and likely better quality offspring than those produced by short-calling male frogs. Sexual selection has been a controversial topic for biologists for a long time. But as we've seen in the past few decades, a lot of research has gone into the nature of sexual selection and the benefits of it. And it turns out that sexual selection, while originally a source of consternation for Darwin and his colleagues, may actually be the most Darwinian form of evolution of all, because it proves the fact that not only is survival important, but reproduction is important as well. In fact, when we look at a lot of these traits, these sexual dimorphisms, we see natural selection working at its finest. A lot of these traits, for example, are under some sort of stabilizing selection. We can go back to the work of Malta Anderson to see this. What they found is essentially, no matter how long they made the tails of long-tailed widow birds, it would continue to increase the reproductive success of those long-tailed widow birds. But imagine if a long-tailed widow bird's tail got so long that it wasn't able to fly. At some point, the scales would have to be balanced, right? At some point, you can't subtract from survivability anymore and counterbalance it with reproductive success. At some point, a male widow bird, long-tailed widow bird could get a tail so long that it literally couldn't fly and avoid predators. If it survived long enough, would it be able to attract more females to mate with? Absolutely. But the odds of it surviving get so low that it can't survive. There's a balancing act. You want a long tail if you're a male long-tailed widow bird, but you don't want one so long that you can't survive to the point of reproduction. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you learned a lot about sexual selection and a lot about evolution. I hope to see you again in another one of my videos. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.